Hello, welcome to this conversation facilitated by the Susanna Wesley Foundation. At the Foundation, we are a community of scholars and practitioners who promote dialogue, support research and create resources in order to equip churches and those who work in them, and to facilitate the building of flourishing community through transformative change. You can find us at our website, susannawesleyfoundation.org. We hope you enjoy this conversation. My name is Emma Pavey and I work for the Susanna Wesley Foundation, and this is the next in our series of podcasts on our theme Embodied Faith, and today I'm joined by Farai, Mapamula and Luke Larner, so I'm going to get them to introduce themselves. So Farai, do you want to go first?
Thank you, Emma. Thank you very much for inviting us to this really exciting episode of this podcast. I am Farai Mapamula. I work in the Birmingham circuit as a presbyter. I look after 3 churches, and I'll be moving shortly in the next month or so within the same circuit, but a different context. So I've worked with EDI across the district, and I've worked with Inclusive Gathering Birmingham, and I'm really impassioned by social justice, and I like working with people whom nobody else has ever heard of, whom nobody else will ever see a face of. This is why I'm not really worried about pictures, but I want to hear people's voices. I want to hear people's experiences, not just hearing people's experiences, but trying to find my ministry, my presence, my faith into those stories. How do we journey alongside one another after hearing the stories? Because sometimes it's good to hear people speak, but what does that say to us as Christian people? What does that say to us as disciples?
Thank you. And Luke?
Yeah, my name's Luke. I am an ordained minister in the Church of England, recently ordained, was a lay minister for quite a number of years before that, but I'm a bricklayer by trade originally. So I ran a small works construction business for 10 years. Have found my way into this strange world of ministry and academia almost simultaneously. So I'm currently studying for a doctorate in practical theology through University of Roehampton. Recently finished a master's degree alongside my training for ordination. And it all feels a bit strange. I have to pinch myself sometimes because even the idea, go back 7 years, the idea of doing any kind of higher education was an impossible dream to me. So I'm very grateful for this journey that I've been on, and for Mother Church for paying the bill, I suppose, and for taking a risk on me and investing in me in that way. But I resonate so much with a lot of the things that Farai said. Most of my ministry has been in places that I guess most church people would call at the edges. To me, it's just home. But, I was a member of a Christian motorcycle club for a large number of years. That was sort of where I felt the call to ministry, in spending time with outlaw biker clubs. I was a chaplain in a homeless day centre for 6 or 7 years. I've done work around violence affecting young people, supporting sex workers, all kinds of different things. But the stories and the people I've encountered in those places have been the starting point for most of my theological reflection. These incredibly powerful and challenging stories, not in some kind of exotic way, but just the remarkable lives of remarkable people that have inspired me and challenged my faith. And then a bit like Farai said, how do we weave together with these stories? The thing that I'm really thinking about a lot at the moment is, what does it mean to be in solidarity? If we think of God's mission as going towards the common good, what does it mean for me from my own location as a white working class male to be in solidarity with other groups who are in search of the common good?
Well, I think we'll definitely come back to your current work and studies and what you'd like to see. I'm quite curious in terms of embodied faith, of this idea of calling, because since you're both ministers, of how that felt? Like, how did you know, or how did you feel that you were called to be a minister?
Well, mine was a journey, and the discernment process was just not my own, but of other people around me as well. In fact, predominantly, the discernment was done by other people, because at that point in time, I had lost all sense of self and grounding. I had been homeless for a while, for about 3-4 months, in one of the cities in the northern part of England. I just shouldn't say where exactly. And that period in my life was the most difficult I've ever experienced the rest of my entire life. I hope not to go back there again. I'd come to this country during the turmoil and upheaval in Zimbabwe, during the time when there was this contentious reform program. And I came as an asylum seeker. In fact, at the beginning, I wasn't an asylum seeker. I came to visit friends and thought I would find my way through life in a different country, but it didn't happen that way. And I had to, in the end, seek asylum, which was not the easiest of processes. And that was hard. It's not as people think. Once you're in the process, you realize just how hard it is. And it was during those 3-4 months. In fact, one particular month, when I sat on a bench with a book and a Bible, I had Maya Angelou's collection of poetry, and I Will Rise Again. That kept me going. And it is at that point in time that I was saying to myself, if ever I get to the other side, I want to help anybody who is going through a process like mine and still think and dream about the sun shining again. For me, the African dawn is very, very important in my well-being, because our lives revolve around the sun and the weather and the climate and the seasons, because that's where we get our livelihood. We're grounded. African spirituality is grounded in the elements, in 4 elements. So for me, that was important. And each time I think about how best can I journey alongside in solidarity with this particular person, I think about the sun shining again. Or even thinking in terms of drought, how can this person experience rain and water and their thirst being satisfied at some point? How do I best talk through this? Or even I think in terms of the sun is bearing hot on this particular soul, they're being scorched, they're in the desert, they need shade. How best can I find shade? So for me, it was that kind of process. But then eventually I got out of that place into a better place, and I went to look for somewhere to worship. And this particular sister kept saying to me, speak to your minister, speak to your minister. I can hear you, speak to your minister about this. So I did speak to the minister, and I felt I wanted to share. I didn't want to preach. I felt I wanted to share my experiences and give hope to somebody. But they're talking to these people in North London. They didn't think this was about me telling a story or even writing a book or even writing a journal, not at all. They thought this story would be encouraging other people, but then in the medium of preaching. This is how I ended up being a local preacher. But during that process as well, I was being nudged a different way, wanting to be this grounded person who speaks of faith as the basis of what keeps us going. What makes us truly human is the experience of God in us, with us, around us, when the going gets tough. So my minister at that point in time said to me, Farai, I see a minister in you. Have you ever thought about ministry? I said, no, I haven't, but it's something I could want to explore. So I did. But gradually, for me, it was no longer something I dreamt about on a street bench somewhere in the north of England, not at all. I had always dreamed that I wanted to go to a Bible class and talk about these experiences. I want to stand up one day and talk to people about how hard it is to be who I am, but at the same time, something keeps me going. I want to talk with somebody and say, the Eucharist, Holy Communion, for me, it's not just Holy Communion. It's about me knowing that I'm loved, knowing that I'm being invited to be with other people who might not even know my story, but somehow I don't know theirs, but somehow there's one strand of story that keeps us together, and that is the story of love, incarnate in Christ. So talking about all these things made me realize that I think I'm being called to presbyteral ministry. I didn't know what that was. I grew up a Methodist. My father worked for the church, so did my mother. Many ministers had come to stay in our house at some point because my father worked in education, and we lived in a month at a mission school. And in my childhood, we moved from one month to the other. So for me, living with ministers was something that we just did. But what they did, I don't know. I knew they were ministers. They preached. They gave us a communion. I knew they baptized people. But for me, it was something they did over there. And my faith then was something we did as a family on a Sunday morning or in the evening before we went to bed, or something we did across the table, eating food and being thankful. That is what we did. But at this point in time, that faith had changed into something that became almost embedded in my own bloodstream. I could feel it in my veins. It was no longer faith, but something that almost coming to inhibit me. I don't know, inhabit, right? Inhabit, yes, that's the right word. Something that came and lived within me, something I could feel pounding with the same heartbeat as mine. I couldn't give it a name, but for me, that was the Spirit of God, the indwelling Spirit of God that says to me, come, I love you the way you are. You can get off that bench and tell that story, but that must be a story of hope, not of judgment.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Luke, what about your story?
Wow, yeah. I mean, it's amazing to me how many connection points with my own very different story and experiences, but that resonate with me through what Farai's just shared. I mean, yeah, I guess my journey into sort of recognised ordained ministry in the Church of England is very recent. And it all kind of started with a friend of mine who's a priest who I'd been working with a bit on a project in the diocese, took me out for a Nando's, and there's a nice Nando's in the shadow of St Albans Cathedral. So Father Eddie took me out for a cheeky Nando's after this meeting, and I'd gone into the diocesan office. I'd ridden there on my old motorbike when I still had a motorbike with all my levers and all that, and you get all these funny looks from people sort of saying, what do you want? And I said, I'm here for a meeting at the Dean's house. And then they're like, oh right, okay. But anyway, so he'd taken me out, and while we were eating, just sort of straight out asked me, have you ever considered that you might be called to be a priest? And I laughed in his face, was my immediate reaction, and said to him, well, how many priests do you know that look like me and talk like me and have had my kind of life experiences? And he sort of said, well, you'd be surprised, and the rest is history, as they say. But I can remember talking some of this stuff through with a mate in New Zealand whose nickname is Buckshot, because he'd been shot by a gang in New Zealand and still had a fair bit of buckshot left in him. So that was what we all knew him as, this guy, interesting old character, who's an Anglican priest. And I was talking it through with him, and I felt very anxious at this real sense of like imposter syndrome about the whole thing. And he said, just ask 3 questions when you go and talk with the bishops and whoever else about it. He said, who do the people that you serve see when they look at you? So who do the people, where I was chaplain in a homeless day centre, who do they see when they look at me? Who do, the other groups that I serve see when they look at me? He said, who do you see when you look in the mirror? And then he said, finally, the question you need to ask to the church is, who do you see? Who does the church see when the church looks at me? And I've kind of offered those questions to back to the church as I've gone through this process. And there's all this kind of self-assessment culture that we have now, you know, write an essay about your own sense of vocation to the priesthood. And I've often had to go back and say, it doesn't really matter what I think, because it's the church that recognises and legitimises the ministry. I'm not going to stand here and say, well, if God calls, then I know it will happen, because what about all the women who never got to be ordained? What about all the people who were excluded because of other intersections of identity that never got to be ordained and still don't get to be ordained because of that? So I put it back to them and said, what do you see? And I think as we're talking about embodiment, you know, I have these memories of like walking around in the diocesan offices for these meetings, and I see all these lovely paintings on the wall of these old white men who are kind of previous dignitaries of the diocese. Lovely people, I'm sure, I'm not judging them. But I just remember looking at these paintings and thinking, I might be white and I might be male, but I don't identify with what I'm looking at here. It doesn't look like me. This place doesn't feel like a physical space that my body belongs in this space. I feel out of place in here. The artist Grayson Perry talks about this idea of default man, and he describes it in a very embodied way, as an artist would. This sort of capable, successful, self-controlled default man that is our vision of success in Western society. And I kind of think it feels similar to in Willie James Jennings' recent book, After Whiteness, when he talks about formation within theological education and ministerial training. And he says this idea that what are we being formed into? We're being formed into the master's son, ready to take on the master's inheritance. This is this kind of image he sets up. So I feel like there's some resonance between these two things and my own experiences. He uses beautiful language, Grayson Perry. He describes it this way. He says, perhaps it's the association with heavy manual labour. This is describing the working class body. Perhaps it's the association with heavy manual labour. Perhaps they see something chaotic and grotesque in the flaunted flesh, the tattoos, the beer gut, as opposed to the buttoned up middle class controlled body. And when I read that, it just resonated so powerfully with how out of place I often feel in these environments. There's something about the body that I bring into these spaces which somehow speaks of chaos and produces fear for the system, if you want to use that kind of language. And yet in a way where people find it appropriate to talk about it like it's nothing. Like I've literally had people say to me when I'm going to do something at a church, don't worry, we've warned the church about what you look like. You know, I've had someone make fun of a picture of me that was in the diocesan report because they thought it must be like a stock image of these words like ruffian leaning against a motorcycle, because they couldn't believe that I was actually a minister in this diocese. They assumed it was like a stock picture and they'd used it to try and make this publication look good. They couldn't really see me. All they could see was this uncomfortable body in front of them. But then alongside that, in recent years, you know, I had this real kind of white working class man's rage about all of this. But then alongside all of that, I've needed to think recently about, well, what is my particular working class body? You know, I need to be aware, what are the dynamics of ableism when I talk about a body that's accustomed to heavy manual labour? Not every working class body is able-bodied. And there are questions about sexuality, there are questions about gender in this mix. What about the more vulnerable parts of ourselves that somebody like me might want to hide? What about the way that my body, the reaction my body might provoke in others who have been victims of violence from people who look like me? So there's all these kind of weird dynamics going on along the same time as this call to ministry, where the body has been such a key location for me to do this reflection of what am I bringing, what self am I bringing into these sacred spaces and academic spaces very much so as well. And why is it that feels so uncomfortable a lot of the time? I was going to ask you, Farai, if it's okay, there's a couple of things you said that really I picked up on. One of them, you talked about the relationship with the weather and having a grounded spirituality. And that just made me smile because, of course, having been a bricklayer and worked outside for most of my life, the sun shining would determine whether I got paid that day. You know, if it rained, I didn't get paid. If I didn't lay my quota of bricks for that day, I didn't get paid. And there's something about those kinds of experiences which I think most people in sort of stipendiary ministry or professional academic work just can't understand how those experiences shape you as a person and shape your spirituality and the way you interact with nature. So I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that and what like how you feel that that's shaped you.
It did shape me in more ways than one, because that's just who we are. We are earthly people. I'll speak for my own heritage, which is Shona. My mother is Shona, a different tribe from my father, who is Zulu. So they ended up together, and I speak both languages. However, there's a strong sense of self in who we are. There's a strong sense of connectedness to nature, because we have what you call totems. I'm of the Lovo totem, which means elephant. But what that meant originally before colonialism was, if you're of the elephant clan, your duty is to take care of the elephant as well. So each totem has a strong sense and connectedness and groundedness in whatever natural, I don't want to say embodiment, whatever it is that comes in nature that is associated to your identity, that is your sole responsibility. And for me, that is more or less like eco-church. We have responsibility of the environment within which we live. We have a responsibility to take care of God's creation. And this is before Christianity. There's that sense of who we are in terms of nature and all creation together. This is how we sustain each other. Then lovers will look after the elephant, will look after the minor creatures that follow it to the water, to the pond where they drink. The elephant will lead the way to pasture and water. But the smaller animals who can walk faster, then they go fast or notify the rest of the herd if there's any danger. So that interconnectedness grounds me in my faith and my spirituality, because that's who we are. And in terms of weather, we're always watching the weather, because we originally we're subsistence farmers. We only took what we needed, just like manna. You only collect what you need for that day. And what you collect, if there's any surplus, it went to what was called Zundera Mambo, meaning the chief's granary. This is where all those who are marginalized, the poor, the weak, go to the chief to get fed. They're fed by a common granary, which in a sense, we've lost over time, because now it's all individual looking after themselves and their family, but there's no thoughtfulness of the poor, of those who can't fend for themselves, who are normally fed by the communal pot. So for me, the weather as well speaks to both the weak and the strong. The weak will know that the strong will now go to plant for our collective well-being. And the strong will know that now we've got a responsibility towards all the other people who rely on us, all the other elements of nature that rely on us. So there's that interconnected, that the responsibility, that accountability even, that we exist for one another. We exist with one another. The spirit of Ubuntu, we gather together. There's an idiom in our language where we say, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together. That is the strength of a community of believers, almost like Martin Luther King's idea of the beloved community, where we all exist for one another, where all sense of hierarchy is dismantled, where all sense of superiority is dismantled, where all sense of, in this present day, whiteness, which is what is normative, is dismantled into the true identity of who we are as people. We are the human family, we are the human race, not whiteness or blackness, but just human race. So yeah, this is why I'm grounded in the weather. I love the weather. And I'm known for always being cold, because for me, everything revolves around what God gives us. And what God gives us freely is nature. And what are we destroying freely? Nature.
Wow.
Were there things in what Luke said that resonated with you?
Oh, you spoke about the body, and almost sometimes the responses people get, you're imagining how people who have been perhaps brutalized by a large body or small body or white body like yours. But for me, it's been a sense of Blackness as an identity as opposed to ethnicity. That has always been a problem. Because before I speak, my body says who I am. But we know the society is now racialized, where in the past it was about ethnicity rather than race, where we know the stories and look the stories in the Gospels, the stories in the Torah, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, they speak about where you came from or your tribe or who your father is, but not race. But then when we start racializing things, even crime is now racialized. So before you even open your mouth, your body presents something that is a threat to society. Without my even opening my mouth, I get followed around in a shop. I go to this church one day, there's this big funeral happening. And I'm greeting people. I'm in a cassock. There's no way you can miss a cassock and a dog collar. Because this family prefer that I wear a cassock. So I'm standing there greeting people and passing my condolences to people that I don't know. So somebody said to me, oh, you haven't seen those two gentlemen over there. They're part of the families that have lost their loved one. So I went there directly to greet them and welcome them to our church because they'd come from a different town. This man just looks at me, doesn't even respond to my greeting, just said, I don't like your hair. I had my long dreadlocks then, and they were always tied anyway in a bun when I was working. So I just said, well, thankfully, we're not here for my hair this morning. We're here for this funeral and welcome to our church. And I walked off. So I went straight to the store and I said, this has just happened. I didn't know how to read. What was that all about? I don't know. We have this huge gathering in one of the village churches where we have a community gathering for Remembrance Sunday. I'm preaching at this place. We process down from the church to the cenotaph. We get there. We had a really memorable event and village fair of prayer and remembering. And to be honest, I struggle with Remembrance Sunday for all sorts of reasons. Coming from a colonial place, it is difficult. So it was a difficult Sunday for me, besides I was preaching. So we processed down and all the refreshments were taking place at our church. So we get there, I sit at a table, we're having tea. Somebody from the civic leadership comes and sits across next to me and says, so who are you? And I said, my name is Farai Mapamula. So what do you do here? Mind you, I'm wearing a black cassock and a dog collar, and it's Remembrance Sunday, and I've just preached. What do you do here? Oh, I'm the minister at this church. You're the minister? And I said, yes. Okay. So how does that work in Methodism? Who do you work under? I knew where this was getting to because I've come across it so many times. But me being me, I really got fed up of this kind of treatment from people. So I just said, well, in Methodism, we don't have bishops, we don't have hierarchy. We have conferences and committees and people working together. So no, I don't work for anybody. I work for God. No, I meant, do you have an archdiocese? Do you have? And I said, like I said, I'm the minister at this church. And I work in this place as a Methodist minister. I could go on and on and on. But this body presents something to people that says, you are inadequate. This body says to people, you are incapable. This body says to people, you probably can't speak very good English. therefore you're stupid. But I speak 3 other languages. So the experience of being a Black woman in the role of a minister or in ministry, exercising public ministry, is very different from what I hear from my other sisters and brothers talking about their own experiences. And I kept saying to people, well, yes, I did go to training. Yes, I responded to the call to ministry. And yes, I trained at Queen's like all the other ministers, most of them anyway, majority of ministers in the circuit. I did go to Queen's like the others. Oh, really? Okay. So, well, oh, okay. We went to this gathering one afternoon, and we were registering. It was a charity thing. We were working for raising funds for something. And we had to register our names to keep people safe. So I walked there with people. Remembering I'm in a dog collar. I get to this place. These are Methodist people. We are all nice people. But I've gone beyond niceness now. We get to this place. Somebody says, "What's your name?" And I told them. She looks at me and said, "Is that your name?" And I said, "Yes." Then the person sitting next to her, who knew me, says, "Wait till you hear the sermon." I went to another gathering, the same circuit, different church. Somebody said, "Oh, welcome. Are you here for so-and-so?" "No." "Oh, why are you here then?" "Well, I'm a minister in this circuit," because I wasn't wearing a dog collar. So the assumption is I've come for a certain Black family. I cannot be seen as part of this worshiping community in the circuit. Either you are there as a minister, you've been sent by the Methodist Church to bring your presence and gifts to this place. But if I'm not in a dog collar, if I'm in a place of worship, I'm here because of perhaps Emma or Luke. You can't be here by yourself. Why are you here then? So these are the interesting things that this body presents, and whether it's a threat or whether it's assumption, but mostly there's been assumptions, and predominantly negative assumptions, predominantly negative stereotypes. However, there's been light and joy and hope where my sisters and brothers actually stood up for me. Before I even answered, somebody else had already answered and said, "Don't speak to me like that." I remember we sat together at a second event together. I'm not talking about what happens to this body outside of church. Let's try to confine this to our communities as worshiping people. And we're sitting at a table, gathered with other ministers and talking to people, having tea and biscuits. Somebody comes along and says, "They've always been doing that, remind you, they've always been doing this to me." And I just didn't know what to do. I'd come to the end of my tether, so I just didn't respond. They came back again at this table and says to me, "Are you behaving yourself?" He looks to this person and says, "Is she behaving herself again? Is she behaving herself today?" Next to me was sitting one of my brothers in Christ, and he said, "That is highly inappropriate, and I'm not responding to that. It's not worthy of a response." And he looked aside. Since that day, that person has never said it again. My point being, this body, in as much as it might threaten people, in as much as assumptions and stereotypes may be made about it, hope comes in the solidarity with my other brothers and sisters who can stand up and speak. That brings me to a very interesting conversation I had with a sister this morning. Or was it last night? I did a sermon on Racial Justice Sunday on the 18th of April, and I was talking about moving from racial injustice or racism awareness to a place of anti-racism and good allyship. So she said to me, "If I am very uncomfortable about that word allyship." And I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "Well, it just means that we need white people with power to carry us along, move us along, help us cross the Red Sea. because without their assistance, we don't have agency to liberate ourselves. What we need is solidarity, not allyship. And I said, wow, now I feel challenged. And that sermon is on YouTube. It's already on the Methodist website, on our district website. And I said, don't worry about it. We are meaning the same thing. And she said, what did you mean? I said, I meant solidarity. And said, yeah, perhaps that word allyship, we should not really pay too much attention to it, rather pay attention to solidarity. So I'm not too sure what that brother was saying on my behalf, but I think it was solidarity. If it's allyship, I think I tend to agree with her now. It says something about power dynamics. It says something about non-relinquishing of power, because the agent still is held by those people who have power. So if the disenfranchised need us to go and help them, whereas we always say, God before us. So if God is already there, God is already helping those people. All we need is to bring our gifts and skills to journey alongside. So yeah, I tend to agree with it.
I think that's a really key distinction that you've made there. And it's one I've been trying to reflect on a lot. I used to be like the kind of classic white van man who would sit around and complain about where's all this white male privilege that I'm supposed to have. You know, like you kind of hear that rhetoric sometimes, particularly among working class white men. And I do think that there is a sense in which social class isn't given enough airtime in some of the conversations that are had, you know, in the academy, in the church. It's not something I hear people talk about all that often. However, a key memory for me, I was talking with a good friend who's an academic and graduated with a Cambridge PhD and all the rest of it. We'll call her Louise for the sake of argument. And she was talking about some of this stuff. And in a very cheeky way, I said to her, well, thank you very much, Dr. Louise, for telling me about my privilege. But I need to get back to laying bricks now, or I'm not going to get paid today. And quick as a flash, she responded, I hear where you're coming from, but when was the last time you were afraid when you were walking home at night? And in that moment, it suddenly dawned on me what is so obvious probably to most people, but that the different parts of ourselves operate with power and privilege in very, very different ways. You know, and of course, this is partly what Kimberly Crenshaw was talking about when she started talking about intersectionality, and about how for many people, they're in a position of triple jeopardy in the relationship between oppression and the different parts of themselves, be that their gender, their ethnicity, their sexuality, etc., etc., etc. And recently I was involved in a campaign against plans by the Home Office to put people seeking asylum in these awful porter cabins right next to Yarlswood Immigration Removal Centre, which is a horrible, horrible place. And has the association of being deported for people that are in the asylum system. And I was working with a close friend who's a leader in one of the local councils of mosques. And I love working with her because I always know that when we get together, we're going to be naughty. You know, we're both sort of quite rebellious souls. But as we were talking and you know, about our different experiences and things while we were working together, she helped me realize something really important, which is that when the church talks to me, they often want me to talk about class if that's on the table for discussion. But actually, and you know, like I've mentioned already, there are things about my body which signal social class, and my voice and other things like that. But actually for her being a woman, her being from a majority world heritage, and her being a Muslim, means that no one ever talks about the fact that she's more working class than I am. She's had more of a working class upbringing than I have. And so it's weird that we have these conversations where, you know, we were reflecting on our experiences post 9/11 and the 7/7 bombings, and how those two events that were at a key moment in our lives growing up, because we're a similar age, affected the outcomes of our lives. And actually, when I see somebody like my friend this is somebody who I should be in solidarity with. This is somebody who is being oppressed by power, who is not getting access to, the slippery ladder up to the top. And yet most of the narrative around this stuff would try to set me against her. Me as a white working class male would set me against her as a Muslim woman from a majority world heritage. So I've had to do a lot of work of reflecting, well, what does this solidarity thing look like? How do we have an intersectional solidarity which pays attention to different parts of ourselves? But more importantly, how do we get there? I mean, I'm a bricklayer. I'm interested in seeing my day's work at the end of the day, seeing what we've made together as a team. And sometimes for me, it means getting out of the way. Farai, you talked absolutely rightly that this saviour complex, which is so often associated with Christian mission and is so rooted in our colonial history of mission. Sometimes for me, my inclination might be I want to be the rent-a-dog collar at the, pro-Palestine protest or the this protest or the that protest. Actually, I don't know if that's really what people want or need today. Is another, a rent-a-collar out at the front of the march with a megaphone kind of thing. But actually, sometimes it is learning the skills of solidarity building, learning to change the narrative in my own faith community, where that narrative leans more towards the right wing. And then in my master's dissertation, I did a lot of reflection through the lens of kenosis about this idea in Philippians chapter 2 of Christ becoming a servant, and actually how, I sort of thought of myself as this kind of suffering missionary going out on my motorbike with my big red cross on my back and all the rest of it. But this couple of theologians, Lynn Marie Tonstad and Kent Brintnell, who paint this picture of how actually sometimes in missiology, where it draws from this idea of kenosis, you get this image of the missionary as this kind of suffering white male saviour who appears to risk everything, but actually has everything to gain through what they're doing. Actually, they gain social capital through, oh, God bless you for going and, being a minister in Luton, this dreadful town. God bless you for what, and actually you're not really losing anything. So Kent Brintnell frames it as being like the missionary as 80s action movie hero. And I really had to unpack some of that and how that mindset had gotten into me. Big questions about what's the relationship to suffering here? Well, if it's about self-emptying, what does that mean for people that have got nothing left to lose? All these kinds of questions. And then really kind of landed that research in thinking about prophetic dialogue, in genuine dialogue where there can be a yes and a no between people, and thinking about that work of developing a kind of deep intersectional solidarity, which doesn't mean I need to be the one that gets to talk about the work at the conference. I need to be the one that is, all of this kind of stuff. And the temptation for me, is to keep doing that white working class thing of, well, what about me? What about my privilege that I'm supposed to have? What about my gaining proximity to power? What about my access to the educational establishments now in this new place that I'm in as an educated member of the clergy? But it is to stop and to listen and to think about, I love that phrasing that you've used, if you want to go far, go alone. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Is actually what for me, I think it's about not fighting over the crumbs from the master's table, but flipping the table and saying, I believe Christ is calling us to equity. You talked about the Eucharist earlier, Farai. For me, it's, I have quite a high view of the Eucharist as an Anglo-Catholic. But really, for me, it's that life of community that is symbolised and enacted in the Mass, where we are equal around the table, where everybody is fed. It is taking that life symbolised in the Mass out of the church doors and making it a reality. That, for me, is what I draw from the Catholic tradition more than the lace and the gin and the nice choral music and flowers and all of that.
Well, I really like what you said about solidarity. How do we get to solidarity? And I was just thinking also in terms of what you've just said about the Eucharist and God's table. I'm thinking about equity, about moving away from the table once you are full. Make room for others who are still hungry. Instead of then think that now I'm full, it's up to me, it's my duty now to distribute the bread. No, the bread is distributed by God. Preferential option for the poor. God distributes the bread. We are just there to serve people. Because sometimes that white savior syndrome, it comes in very subtle ways. I'll just give an example. That when we help people, we want to be remembered. We want that to be remembered and documented, that this is what we've done as Methodist people. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, because we need to be accountable, but there's a certain way that things are done that sometimes just feel or look like grandstanding or even tokenism, because charity can be quite disempowering, but justice is not disempowering. One example, for me, one good example is All We Can. It empowers people, acknowledges the resources and the skills of the local people rather than what we bring to people. So if we always have this stance of us bringing the change or making change or effecting change, I think we are starting on a wrong footing, because change is about people. It's about all people, not people with power. Therefore, something needs to be said about relinquishing that power and allowing other people to also arm themselves with that power in order for them to speak through their own experiences, that you and I might also get salvation out of other people's experiences. Because sometimes it's like, oh, we're done, we're dusted, we're good. Now it's your turn, we're trying to save you from yourselves.
That's so true.
Actually, it's us who need saving from ourselves and our ego. And in a sense of privilege, I don't think it's about economic privilege. I think it's the privilege to be understood, to be believed, not to be negatively stereotyped, not being racially profiled, but privilege is about those intricate policies and procedures that have been put in place for the longest of time that pit one person against the other, that uphold and undergird superiority, that uphold and undergird white supremacy. And I think that that's the privilege that we need to be very conscious of and know that it exists. And by denying its existence, we are doing violence not just to ourselves, but to those people that we think we're in solidarity with. That's
right. Yeah, I mean, one of my favourite reads of the last few years is a book by a rapper called Akala, called Natives.
Yes.
And he writes about how the whole history of the racialization of people and the class structure in the UK is based literally on getting people fighting over the crumbs from the master's table. And that is literally the whole history. You know, Bob Dylan sang about it in the 60s. People have been talking about this stuff for years. That's the history of it. And so, and I think you're right, you know, this whole framing around charity and church and measurement. Oh my goodness, these measurement things. What is it about men and having to measure things? I don't know. But, you know, there's a whole difference. I mean, I've got really interested in community organizing as a methodology. It's not perfect, but it's one of the least harmful tools I've found so far. And there's a huge difference between charity, which is where I keep the power and I get the social capital. And, you know, maybe I'll give you a tin of beans from my food bank or whatever else. And then I've tried this thing of advocacy. You know, what does it mean to come alongside people, to go with the person when they have their meeting with the local council housing officer, to go with the person, you know, when they need to go and see a specialist of some kind or another. But actually, those things are kind of good and we kind of need both of them temporarily. But the gospel for me is more about organizing for justice. You know, how do we come together? And so that's why my doctoral research is looking at how do Anglicans involved in organizing theologize the work of the Holy Spirit, and what is the Spirit doing? I perceive the Spirit is bringing people together, different faith traditions, different backgrounds, all kinds of things, to say, how do we put legs on this stuff? I always tell the story, you know, when I was a builder, I remember fitting a roof window on a roof we were building. And the inspector came out to look at it and sort of said, oh, why have you done it that way? And we said, oh, well, that's the manufacturer's instructions to do it that way now. And he said, I bet some idiot in a university came up with that idea. And that's kind of how we felt about academic type of knowledge, because to us, it was this thing that we had no access to, and it was completely impractical and useless in the real world. You couldn't actually do it, you know. And so for me, like whenever I'm thinking about these kinds of ideas, I'm saying, this is great, but what does it look like? That's why I'm a practical theologian, not a constructive or a systematic theologian. This is great, but what does it look like? Actually, whose voices are not being heard as we produce knowledge? What types of voices, what types of knowing are we excluding from the conversation? Because as we say in community organising, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're probably on the menu.
Exactly. I quite like what you said about your studies, without trying to be a bit competitive. No, not at all. I'm studying for a master's in transformative ministry, and one of the modules that really fired me was on global migration, a theology of migration, and trying to change our thinking regarding migration, that we have all migrated from one place to the other in our lives. And because it might be because of work, or because of relationships, or breakdown, or building, because of employment, because of education, for all sorts of reasons. But the majority of people who have privilege on their side, that migration has never been known as migration. It has just been somebody moving to better their lives. But when it's migration of people of less privileged backgrounds, it has been immigration. They've been moving from one place to other. It has been either legalized or illegalized. It's legitimated or it's not legit for one reason or another. There's all sorts of laws surrounding migration if it's of those that don't look like us, so to speak. I did a presentation and I had the picture of what purportedly the Hebrew people walking across the desert, and Moses and Joshua then eventually leading them. And I put this side by side with people scrolling under a razor sharp fence, and life jackets floating in the Mediterranean. And I subsequently wrote a poem about the Sahara and migration. And we don't see these things together as people migrating, because one is a group of empowered exception people who are chosen to actually deserve liberation. Then there's a certain group of people that for some reason we've racialized and we've decided they are not worthy of any liberation, let alone assistance. But I like what Richard Ross said, I think 2-3 months ago, about migration, that sometimes our salvation needs migration from there to there. Migration of ideas from the head to the heart, because it is the heart where the indwelling spirit can transform us as individuals, our communities, and eventually nations and the whole human race. And I think that is very important to understand that migration is not just about people who are disadvantaged. Migration can happen to anybody at any given time, but what then do they arrive to? What do they get to? And how do we speak of those people's experiences regarding how they then belong as people in our communities? Because there's a sense that we keep talking about the Syrian refugees who've been helped by this community. The Iraqi refugees were, we don't even pretend that we want to know them by name. We don't even learn their names. They're just lumped in this group of people. So where is the liberation that we are saying we are assisting? Because there's no salvation without liberation. And who needs salvation? Is it us or those people over there who don't look like us, whom we think don't deserve any liberation? But I think theologies of liberation are not just about the marginalized, but it's about the powerful that need to be liberated from the false gods and the false truths they tell themselves.
I totally agree. And you see that in the Magnificat, I think. You know, if you pay attention to the movement that happens in Mary's song, it's not just that the poor are being lifted up.
Yeah.
that it is the you know, the proud are being brought down, and actually, if the poor are coming up and the proud are brought down, maybe there's a chance that we can find somewhere together. You know, but that thing. I mean, that whole thing about paying attention to space and movement. You know, in what you just talked about in regards to migration, I've been paying attention to some of the language about how we talk about that in the mission of the church. So I'm an ordained pioneer minister and was a lay pioneer minister before. But I find that term pioneer quite interesting and actually quite problematic. Because in a similar way to what you've described, a pioneer, it's like the equivalent of talking about an immigrant or an expat. You know, a pioneer is a person of privilege who goes and seizes the resources and people of a land and takes over it and dominates it and gets rid of anything that they don't like there. Whereas the New Testament word is more like pilgrim. You know, and a pilgrim has a very different relationship to the land and the people than what a pioneer does. That's why I've got a peregrine falcon tattooed on my hand, which was I think it was the last tattoo I had done before I started training for ordination, which comes from that. I think it's in 1 Peter when it talks about being strangers and aliens in the land. You know, the word in the original language, it actually means like non-citizen workers in a city. You know, like migrant workers, basically, is the kind of, it says that Christians are like migrant workers in the city. And actually, probably many of them literally were migrant workers in the city when that was being written. And so there's something about this idea of wandering for Christ, of traveling lightly and of expecting to meet Christ in the stranger wherever we go. That feels very different to this language of pioneering to me that I'm feeling increasingly uncomfortable with. And that's something that I'm playing with some others, that kind of language. And, you know, look at somebody like St. Francis as an example of that, who talked about, you know, you're kind of being evangelized by the people that you meet. It's not so much about me doing the evangelizing, but being evangelized. And, you know, there are some pitfalls in that point of view as well. But there is something about changing. Well, my mate Al Barrett talks about reversing the church's flow. You know, what flow is it? God the King, and then God the King's Son, and then this spirit that we don't really know what to do with, and that flows through the bishop and the priest and the deacon out into the world? Or is there? And of course, we all know that mission went from Jerusalem to Rome to England and then everywhere else, don't we? You know.
Oh yes. That brings us to epistemology. What is truth? What is knowledge? How do we actually decide that this is what we want to record? Or when we know that the origins of early Christianity were not in Western civilization, not at all. They were in North Africa. So how did we migrate, so to speak, from a place of Middle Eastern understanding of who we are in our relationship with God, and then it becomes about this Mammon who is worshipped alongside gold, alongside colony, alongside the buying and selling of human black bodies? How did we get to that? And finding scripture to actually support that. How did we get to that? So something needs dismantling our own understanding of who we are as people. How did we start? Where did this start? And what is the presence of this thing we call our faith, our understanding of who we are as Christian people? Where does it sit now in this present moment?
And then I think, you know, for me, as we're talking about embodied theology, as we do our work reflecting on this stuff, it comes back to Audre Lorde's classic maxim of you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. So for me, that is why bringing in embodied reflections, autoethnography, you know, I mean, I you know, often in my academic writing, I get told to tone the language down and stop using so many colloquialisms. But actually, I think it's important that those of us who feel some sense of distance to the master's tools do get to bring ourselves into our academic work. If we're believing in a gospel of liberation, there's going to be epistemological challenges that come with that. What does an epistemology of liberation look like? What does the reflexivity that's rooted in praxis, not just me saying, I'm really sorry that, you know, I'm British, but I'm going to do my theology anyway. What does it look like to say I have a Christian vocation to solidarity? I have a Christian vocation to struggle for the common good alongside my brothers and sisters. And therefore that should shape how I do my theological work, not because Aristotle said so, not because Plato said so,
or Kant,
or Hegel, the Geist, this whole idea of this spirit that just so happens to mainly take a diversion through Europe. All of these things, yeah. What do we do with that? That's what I'm trying to learn, and I'm learning it, through conversations like this, really. I think that's what embodied theology kind of looks like to me.
I've heard you speak, Farai, about creating new stories, and I feel like maybe you're doing that a little bit in this conversation, but I wondered if you could speak a bit about that. You've talked about the importance of oral tradition and stories.
Most of my heritage from my own family has been passed on from generation to generation with integrity. This is our story as people. And then it has now changed. This is our story as the Mapamula family, for example. And this is our story in who we are. This is our story with God. This is our story with the other. But if that's not written down anyway, if nobody else hears about it, it's not a story. But it only becomes a story when it is heard, when it is spoken, and more to the point, when it is believed. So I think it's now time that we record these stories or talk together and find a place where we can archive the stories and learn from, see what patterns emerge from those stories and what we can learn from those patterns. Perhaps those patterns will say something to the way even our structures in the Methodist Church, for example, are shaped. Why do we have such a structure? Who is it serving? Why was it put in place in the first place? Who were we trying to serve? Because if we can answer those questions using these stories that formulate who we are, I think we'll make strides towards equity and equality. Because working with EDI across our district and working with people and trying to put stuff together as a people of God together, I asked a certain brother about their story and their racism working in the Methodist Church. And they said to me, Farai, I've recounted this story more than 100 times. And I want to know what you are going to do about it now you hear it for the perhaps 101st time. What do you plan to do with the story? Why do you want to hear it? And does it mean that all the other 100 stories were voyeurism? Because I think we're falling into a trap of wanting to hear a story. But what do we do with them? That brings me to our practices as Christian people and Methodists in particular. But that is my tradition. I speak from that. I'm sorry, Luke. There are a lot of policies that we put in place, but there is always that great chasm between policy and practice. And that chasm is where the Spirit of God is lying. This is where the solidarity lies. This is where God is saying to us, cross that chasm. How do we do it together? Because the policies are not serving people. Maybe they are, but why do we keep more and more? Why do we keep making more and more? It means the first one perhaps didn't serve us as much as we thought it would, or perhaps the world has changed. So perhaps we need to interrogate those stories that we already know. What are they saying to us? What patterns are forming? And what themes are we getting out of those stories? So I think this is where our epistemology will really be embedded. Get those stories together. Get people together who want to put these stories together and make sense out of them. Make salvation apparent. Make the Spirit burn and blaze within these stories so that they can help us as a people.
That's really powerful. Yeah, I mean, the thing you just said there about voyeurism is key. Because, I think I do hear this turn to stories myself. And anybody who, like me, has previously been a missionary will know that stories sell. You want to get your money in from XYZ rich church somewhere to pay for your mission dues for that year. You want to tell some really exciting, exotic stories about your mission work and the people and all the rest of it. So I think stories can be a commodity that can be exploited if we're not careful. But the flip side of that is I've seen the power of people being amplified to tell their own stories in community organising and give testimony in a way that the power of that story is used as a leverage on powerful people to put them in a position where they need to make change because of the power of that story. And that only happens where that person gets to tell their own story. And I think that, you know, there's a huge difference. That's one big difference, I think, between charity and organising.
Yeah, exactly.
Who's telling whose story? Because we all know that the people closest to the pain are closest to the solution. So why am I telling their story for them? You know, how am I contributing to the development and raising up of leaders who are going to bring the change that's needed in their community, rather than it being about, like you say, right, I've got full of bread now, I'm ready to rock and roll. You know, it is about that. Like, I mean, I have to reflect on that all the time. I'm only here wearing this piece of plastic today because someone took a risk on me, even though I was almost passable. If I could just cover up, wear a nice long cassock to cover my tattoos and posh up the way I speak a bit, I was almost passable. But actually, what does it mean to take a risk on leaders whose face doesn't really fit according to whatever standards are?
Sure. Yeah.
We need to see those leaders raised up and empowered and heard. And you know, even that's not enough, because you know, I've had the experience of, if you're someone who's a bit exotic to the institution, they want you if you're a pet, but they don't want you if you're a threat. You know, if you can be their working class voice, that's great. But if you want to start asking questions about the selection training process, if you want to start asking questions about, you know, why is it that things are this way? Why are we doing it this way? Why is it structured? Why don't I get to be in that meeting where you decide what church I'm going to go and work in? How do you think that feels for me as someone who's felt like power is done to me for my whole life, not something that I participate in? You know, so it's not enough to just do the stories thing. We need to ask who is telling the stories and how is that story being used to transform structures.
And I think it says something about power as well. You've spoken about you are the right person to be speaking on this behalf, or this is the voice that want we see, the voice that we want to hear, for example, about Black people. But we are not saying to these Black people, well, I'm here, I'm ready to relinquish my power in this regard so that somebody else can be in that place and instigate change. No, we don't. So I think something about power and relinquishing it, that's the only way we can empower others, by being prepared to be humble enough to step back and saying, if I'm full, I've just been made full. Now it's somebody else's turn to come to the table and speak and decide and be fed and move away and the next and the next, because this is how we do communion. You don't get fed and you keep standing there and getting more and more. You don't. You walk away and let somebody else come so that they can also get fed. So I think that idea of God's table, feeding people and people walking away so that others can come and be fed as well, can be a paradigm of how we do ministry.
And I think that that really chimes with where I got to with my research on kenosis, in that, you know, one Anglican theologian, Sarah Coakley, talks about how kenosis isn't so much about being emptied of what you have, it's about not grasping things that you shouldn't touch.
Yeah.
You know, it's about knowing when not to grasp. And that actually feels less like it's going to oppress people even more who are already oppressed. It's not going to ask people to be emptied who are already got nothing left to give. So I think that's a beautiful image, the way you've painted that. I'm kind of reflecting a lot on the Eucharist in my research, so I'm going to go away and sit with that. But I'll make sure I credit you in the footnotes for planting that idea in my head, because I've never really thought of it that way before.
That's fine.
Taking from the table what is given freely and becoming full, but not stuffing your pockets.
Yeah. Don't stuff your pockets. There's no need for that. We can all get enough if we are all prepared to walk away, get our share and walk away and give others way as well. Keep doing it constantly.
We live in a world of plenty, don't we? And this is the thing where we get into all these complex discussions about, I was in a discussion the other day and there was this whole, this, complex discussion about the economics of this, that and the other. And I was like, yeah, but we made all that up. It's not real. Our economy is not real. We made it up. It doesn't have to be this way because we live in a world of plenty. The food's there on the trees outside, I mean, I was reading the other day that they think that people in when humans were almost all in hunter-gatherer societies, we probably had to work 4 or 5 hours a day to get enough food to subsist, and the rest of your day was have fun, want with your family. So you just think like, what? Why are we doing it this way? It's insane. This is ridiculous.
So what would justice look like then? What marks success? Or how does it feel? I guess if we're thinking about embodiment.
I think justice looks just like that. It looks like justice, where all are fed, where all get equal opportunity, where all can speak, where all can be heard, where all God's people can flourish and give their gifts and their skills to our whole community, the whole world, and be appreciated for who they are, not first recognize, there's that, it's her. No, it's not even, I don't think it's even about how we look at each other in terms of academia, or even in ordained ministry, or even in lay ministry, or even in ministry for that matter. I think it's about how we live together as God's people in the world, in God's world. How is God experienced through us? How do we stand up for those that can't stand up for themselves, regardless of who they are? Because if it comes back to the context of church, it becomes about those that look like us or worship like us. What about those that don't? So I think justice looks like a world when thy kingdom come, when God's kingdom is here on earth, because Jesus says, the kingdom is amongst you. It is here now, but it's up to you to ensure that other people can experience God's kingdom through you, like the peacemakers, the merciful, the kind, the meek, the humble. That is how God's kingdom is experienced here on earth. That is God's justice, I think, when all can experience of that Sermon on the Mount and say, I think that is so, I think that is so and so. I think that's how we're living as people. We are living like those people Jesus was talking about in his Sermon on the Mount. When that kind of beloved community becomes the norm, when it becomes about, this is who we are not even thinking about it. We don't even discuss it because that's the norm. But we have created an alternative norm or normal where there's this class system, this hierarchical system, this economic system that excludes people. And we can talk about 11 million tons of food that gets thrown away, and yet there's a food bank down the road. How does that work? There's dissonance somewhere. And once we try to make sense or even do away with that dissonance, that is the only time we can cross those chasms that stand between us as policymakers and us as practical theologians. How do we cross that chasm when we do away with things that separate people? And usually most of those things that separate us as human race are human constructs. They are not natural. They are not even natural.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the word that would come to my mind is communion, is what it looks like. And that's where Willie James Jennings lands it in his book. He says we should be, our formation as ministers and Christian theologians should be a formation to prepare us for communion, in its widest sense, the koinonia sense. But I mean, you asked, will we ever get there, is an important question. And being someone who's been influenced by process theology, I have to sit with that question. Will we get there on this little old rock in an unremarkable corner of one of 200 billion galaxies, and, on a planet that exists because 2 suns had to die to create a 3rd generation sun that could create a solar system that would sustain life. So I want to believe in a very, very big God. But that means recognizing how very small this little corner of the known universe is that we inhabit. I don't want to say I know that we will get there in this temporal existence that we're in now. You know, will we destroy the planet before we get there? Are human beings as a species evolved highly enough to get there? You know, like Sarah Coakley would talk about how the thing that makes human beings so unique is that we evolved the ability to collaborate in large numbers, which no other animal species has developed the ability to collaborate in huge numbers like we have, which is what enabled us to flourish. Well, could we ever evolve to the stage where we can collaborate in even bigger numbers, in global numbers? Could we really begin to see ourselves as a global community? Could the human race have our physical brains? We're talking about embodiment here. Let's not get too pie in the sky. Are our brains physically evolved enough for us to have that capability as human beings? I don't know, because I'm not a neuroscientist, but you know, these are kind of questions that we need to throw out there so that this doesn't just become too whimsical, utopian. If we all sing Kumbaya and hold hands together, then everything will be okay. You know, I want to believe in a way that is rooted in my earthy lived life as a human creature on this planet. But I do believe fundamentally that a better world is possible. And I do believe fundamentally, to use the language of process theology, that God is luring us on this adventure towards beauty.
And as the name suggests, it's about the process, isn't it?
Yes.
So, you know, learning to surf that wave of the ebbs and flows of life together.
And staying on the process. That's just, yeah. Just stay in.
Yeah.
Don't veer away, just stay in the process.
Keep in step with the Spirit. You know, that's the thing that I keep telling myself all the time. That's why, I say I was a couple of minutes late, because I just needed to go and mindfully walk to the riverbank and back. I'm very privileged to live in a place with a beautiful river that runs through it. And actually I needed to slow down a minute. And that's some of what I think I certainly need to do anyway.
And I always say that we can't afford to walk away.
No.
We just can't. We forfeited that right to walk away when we decided to follow Christ. We can't walk away. We can't even look away. Look at the cross, see the pain, see the nails, hear them. But also believe in the Holy Saturday, preparing you for that resurrection. And resurrection will come, and it has come. We are in the resurrection. But that's not to say we forget about the cross.
Somebody was asking the question recently, why are you still a Christian? Having, I don't want to get lost on this now, but I was a card-carrying Calvinist fundamentalist for a long time. Why am I still a Christian? I just think of the words of the disciples, to whom shall we go? For you have the words of eternal life. And mine and Farai's main connection is through Red Letter Christians UK and some mutual friends, and it is in those red letters is why I am still a Christian, is what I see in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. A house builder like me, who but not like me in many, many, many other ways, of course. And some, I see something there that is powerful and transformational, and is saving me. Is not just the means by which I would ever dare to speak of saving others, but that is what is saving me. And that's okay then when my friend from the Council of Mosques says, I'm sorry, but this whole Holy Trinity thing just sounds like nonsense to me. I'm like, that's okay. That's okay, because this is what's saving me.
Well, listen, I want to thank you for doing this conversation. I'm not on your time because we're nearly up. But I've just kind of sat back and soaked it all in. I really appreciate your time and your sharing. I hope you've enjoyed it as well.
We have.
It's been such a great conversation, and thank you for giving me the chance to try and play with some of these ideas. I still find it hard to have this conversation, and to make sure it comes across right. So it's really valuable to be in such good hands and gentle hands with you both today to try out some of these ideas, because I'm still trying to learn and think about what these are the exact questions I'm wrestling with. How does my body, situate itself in these spaces, in these conversations? And I'm a long way off being there yet, wherever there is. So it's been really helpful for me to distill some of my thinking a bit more, and to hear from you both. Farai, I love listening to you speak. It's just been wonderful.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to hear you, Luke, and the conversation for me, it's just mind-blowing. I love talking about God. And Emma, thank you so much for making this possible. I could talk for hours. I just enjoyed it. And thank you for inviting me, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening to this conversation facilitated by the Susanna Wesley Foundation. You can engage with our work through following us on Twitter and Facebook, and at our website susannawesleyfoundation.org. We would love to hear from you.